Story 1. I once photographed a wedding where the groom barely spoke a word the entire day. From the ceremony to the reception, he was like a statue. No smiles, no small talk, nothing. Meanwhile, the bride was all energy, bouncing from table to table, making sure everything was perfect. She told me multiple times how much the day had to be unforgettable. When I delivered their photos a couple of weeks later, the bride called me, furious. She said the pictures didn't capture happiness and demanded a discount because, in her words, you failed to make him look like he was enjoying himself. I tried explaining that it's hard to make someone appear happy when they look like they're at a dentist's office the whole time, but she wasn't having it. Fast forward about a year, and I heard they got divorced. No shock there. But here's the twist. A few years later, the same groom reached out to me. He was engaged again and wanted me to shoot his new engagement photos. I hesitated but eventually agreed. And let me tell you, this guy was a different person. Laughing, joking, absolutely beaming. I barely had to give him any direction because he was just naturally happy with his new fiancée. Turns out, sometimes it's not the photographer, it's the relationship. Tank. Story 2. One of my favorite memories as a wedding photographer came from a disaster that should have ruined the day. It was a summer wedding in the middle of July, and everything that could go wrong did. The florist sent pink roses instead of white lilies, the caterer showed up late, and the three-tier cake melted in the heat before the reception even started. But instead of breaking down, the bride laughed. "Well," she said, holding up the drooping flowers, "I guess pink is the new white." Her groom joined in, joking that the cake looked like modern art and promising to eat it no matter how it looked. They didn't let a single thing ruin their day. By the time we got to the photos, the couple was making silly faces and posing with the melted cake. I remember thinking, these two have it figured out. Weddings are chaotic by nature, but their ability to roll with the punches was inspiring. Years later, I bumped into them at a friend's wedding, still happy and still laughing. It's couples like that who remind me why I started photographing weddings in the first place. Story 3. The most awkward wedding I ever filmed started with the best man's toast. Picture this. The bride is glowing, walking down the aisle, when the best man stands up and yells, "Drink up, boys! It's your last chance to change his mind!" The groom laughed and took a swig from his flask, while the bride froze mid-step. She recovered quickly, but the moment was ruined. The tension lingered throughout the ceremony, and by the time the reception started, the groom was already drunk. He spent most of the night with his buddies, leaving the bride alone at their table, picking at her food. At one point, I saw her sitting in the corner, her makeup smudged like she'd been crying. She put on a brave face for the guests, but the whole event felt off. A few months later, I heard they'd separated. Looking back, it wasn't surprising. Weddings can reveal a lot about a couple, and there screamed, "We're not on the same page." Tumpa. Story 4. I'll never forget the couple who hired me to photograph their dream wedding. The bride was obsessed with the details. Custom menus, hand-painted place cards, you name it. The groom? He showed up late to the rehearsal dinner and spent most of the evening texting under the table. On the wedding day, he was no better. During the vows, he actually yawned, which earned him a sharp glare from the bride. The real drama started at the reception. When it came time to cut the cake, the bride gently fed him a piece, smiling sweetly. But instead of returning the favor, he smashed the cake into her face with so much force it got in her hair and veil. The bride stormed off, clearly upset, but the groom just laughed it off, saying, "Come on, it's funny." The rest of the night was awkward, with the bride barely speaking to him. They divorced less than a year later, and honestly, no one who was at that wedding was surprised. Edit. After that experience, I decided to stop doing weddings altogether. They're emotionally draining, and no amount of photography skills can fix the tension that's already there. These days, I stick to portraits and product photography. It's a lot less stressful. Story 5. There was this one couple I worked with who, in hindsight, should never have been together. The bride had planned a fairy tale wedding, complete with a horse-drawn carriage and a medieval-inspired gown. The groom, on the other hand, was determined to turn the reception into a poker saloon. He wanted whiskey barrels, cigars, and even tiny sugar pistols on the cake. When they came to me for a consultation, they didn't even acknowledge each other, just talked at me about their wildly different visions for the day. At one point, I asked how they planned to compromise, and they both gave me blank stares. It was clear they hadn't even considered it. I politely declined to shoot their wedding, claiming I was already booked. A few months later, I heard the wedding had been called off entirely. No surprise there. Some couples just don't belong together, and sometimes you can see it long before they do. Story 6. I once worked with a couple who couldn't have been more opposite in how they handled their wedding day. The bride was incredibly organized, a checklist queen who had every detail planned out months in advance. The groom? He didn't even know what time the ceremony started. When I arrived for the photos, the bride was already dressed, checking her makeup in a mirror. The groom, on the other hand, was still in a t-shirt and shorts, casually sipping on a beer. During the ceremony, he stumbled over her name in the vows, not once, but twice. The bride laughed nervously, but I could see her grip tighten on the bouquet. At the reception, he spent most of the night joking around with his groomsmen, leaving her to entertain the guests. By the time I left, she was sitting alone at a table, staring at her untouched champagne. They didn't even make it a full year. Weddings really do show you who's in it for the long haul, and who's just there for the party. King. Story 7. One of the most awkward weddings I ever photographed was held in a small church. The bride and groom seemed sweet enough during the consultation, but things unraveled quickly on the big day. Right before the ceremony, the groom's mother pulled me aside and whispered, "Make sure you get a lot of shots of me. After all, none of this would be happening without me." I thought she was joking. She wasn't. During the family photos, the mother insisted on standing between the bride and groom for every shot. The bride tried to push back, saying she wanted a picture with just her and her new husband. But the mother-in-law loudly declared, "I'm part of this marriage too." The tension was unbearable. At the reception, she gave a speech that started with, "I wasn't sure about her at first," and only went downhill from there. Edit. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that the couple separated within 6 months. Apparently, the groom moved back in with his mom. Some people never really leave the nest, I guess. Story 8. A couple hired me to film their wedding at a beautiful outdoor venue. The bride had an ethereal vibe. Long flowing dress, flower crown, the whole Pinterest dream. The groom, however, looked like he'd been dragged there against his will. He grumbled through the photo session, constantly checking his watch, and when I asked him to kiss the bride for a shot, he rolled his eyes and muttered, "Do I have to?" During the vows, the bride gave an emotional speech about how lucky she was to find her soulmate. The groom's response? "Yeah, same here. Thanks for putting up with me." No joke, that was his entire vow. At the reception, he stayed glued to the bar, and the bride danced alone with her friends. I couldn't help but feel bad for her. A year later, I saw her on social media. New partner, glowing smile, and no trace of the guy who didn't deserve her. Story 9. I was once hired to photograph a destination wedding in Iceland. The scenery was breathtaking. Glaciers, waterfalls, the whole works. But the couple was another story. The bride was furious that the groom had booked a bunkhouse for the wedding party instead of the luxury cabin she'd wanted. She spent the first night complaining loudly to anyone who would listen. And by the next morning, the tension was unbearable. During the couple's glacier shoot, they had a full-blown argument right in front of me. She shouted, "This is supposed to be the most romantic day of my life, and you couldn't even get one thing right!" The groom stormed off, leaving her standing there in her dress, tears streaming down her face. They ended the shoot early, and I later found out they canceled the wedding entirely. Some people just aren't meant to make it to the altar. Story 10. One of the most heartbreaking weddings I've ever filmed started out like a fairy tale. The bride and groom were childhood sweethearts, and their families were thrilled to see them tie the knot. But as the day went on, little cracks started to show. The groom kept making snide comments like, "Well, this was her idea," whenever anyone complimented the decorations or food. The final straw came during the reception. The bride's father gave a tearful toast, saying how proud he was of his daughter. The groom followed it up with a speech that began, "Well, I'm not great at speeches, so I'll keep it short," and ended with, "Here's to my wife. I guess I'm stuck with her now." Everyone laughed awkwardly, but the bride looked devastated. They stayed together for a few years, but I heard through a mutual friend that they eventually divorced. It's always sad when a wedding starts as a celebration and ends as a warning sign. Story 11. One of the most unique weddings I ever worked on took place in the middle of a forest. The couple had planned a whimsical nature-inspired day with climbing structures, fairy lights, and a custom-built wooden arch for the ceremony. Everything seemed magical, until the bride's custom-painted wedding dress didn't arrive on time. She was devastated, sitting in her dressing room, holding back tears. But here's where things took a surprising turn. The groom walked in wearing a plain white shirt and boxers and said, "If you don't get your dress, I won't wear my suit." He stood by her side, completely unbothered by the chaos. When someone suggested they postpone the ceremony, the bride laughed and said, "No way! We've waited too long for this." They exchanged vows under the arch as planned, both in their mismatched outfits, and it turned into one of the most heartfelt weddings I've ever seen. Sometimes it's not about the dress or the decor. It's about the love that shines through the imperfections. G. Story 12. I once worked with a couple who couldn't have been more different in their attitudes toward the wedding. The bride was so excited she arrived 2 hours early, already dressed and ready for photos. The groom? He showed up 20 minutes before the ceremony, still tying his tie. During the vows, he forgot the words, fumbling awkwardly while the bride stared at him, visibly annoyed. The most telling moment came during the cake cutting. The bride carefully fed him a piece, smiling sweetly, but when it was his turn, he smashed the cake into her face so hard it knocked her veil off. She froze, frosting dripping down her face, while the guests laughed nervously. Later, I saw her sitting alone while the groom partied with his friends at the bar. Edit. I heard through the grapevine that they got divorced less than a year later. Apparently, he never really wanted to get married, but went along with it because his family pressured him. Weddings really do reveal a lot about what's beneath the surface. Story 13. A wedding in a small barn venue turned into one of the most uncomfortable experiences of my career. The bride's stepmother had made it clear she didn't approve of the marriage, and she spent the entire ceremony whispering snide comments to anyone who would listen. During the reception, she got into a loud argument with the bride's mother over seating arrangements. At one point, she shouted, "Well, this wedding's doomed anyway," right in front of the bride. The couple tried to keep things light-hearted, but the tension was palpable. When it came time for the father-daughter dance, the stepmother refused to leave the dance floor, standing off to the side and glaring at everyone. It was one of those weddings where you leave feeling more exhausted than inspired. The last I heard, the couple had cut off contact with the stepmother entirely, and honestly, good for them. Story 14. One of the happiest weddings I ever photographed started with a disaster. The bride and groom's outdoor ceremony was interrupted by a sudden downpour. Guests scrambled for cover, and I thought the couple would panic. Instead, they laughed and grabbed each other's hands, running into the rain. "We're doing this!" the bride shouted, holding her soggy bouquet high. They exchanged vows under an umbrella, water dripping everywhere, and it was honestly one of the most beautiful moments I've ever captured. Later, during the reception, they had a spontaneous dance-off to make up for the soaked ceremony, and everyone joined in. By the end of the night, no one cared about the weather. It was the love and joy that made the day unforgettable. Turn 2. Story 15. There was one wedding where the tension started before I even arrived. The bride had sent me a frantic email the night before, saying the groom's family was refusing to follow the seating chart she had carefully planned. When I showed up, the groom's mother was already complaining loudly about being placed too far from the head table. Things only got worse during the toasts. The bride's best friend gave a sweet speech about how the couple was perfect for each other. Then the groom's brother got up and said, "Well, I'm not sure if she's the right one for him, but we'll see how it goes." The room went silent. The bride looked like she was about to cry, and the groom just sat there, saying nothing. Later, during the first dance, the groom stepped on the bride's dress and tore part of the hem. She laughed it off, but by the end of the night, they were barely speaking. A year later, I found out they had split. Weddings aren't just celebrations, they're magnifying glasses for every crack in the relationship. Story 16. There was one wedding I'll never forget because it felt more like a battlefield than a celebration. The bride was incredibly kind and soft-spoken, while the groom's mother was a force to be reckoned with. She criticized everything, from the floral arrangements to the bride's dress, loudly telling anyone who'd listen that she would have done things differently. During the reception, she tried to rearrange the seating chart, placing herself at the head table and moving the bride's family to the back. The bride kept a brave face, but you could see the tension building. It finally boiled over when the groom's mother insisted on giving an impromptu speech. She grabbed the microphone and said, "Let's hope this one sticks because we all know how picky my son can be." The room went silent, and the bride looked like she was holding back tears. They got through the rest of the night, but a year later, I heard they divorced. Apparently, the groom sided with his mother on every issue, and the bride just couldn't take it anymore. Sometimes the biggest red flags aren't between the couple. They're sitting in the audience. Story 17. One of the strangest weddings I ever photographed was at a rural farm venue. The couple had planned a rustic theme, complete with mason jar centerpieces and hay bales for seating. It was all going smoothly until the best man started drinking before the ceremony. By the time the vows rolled around, he was visibly drunk and decided to interrupt the proceedings by shouting, "Kiss her already!" before the officiant had even finished. At the reception, things got worse. The best man grabbed the microphone and gave a speech that started with, "I don't even think these two should be together," and ended with him falling off the stage. The bride left the room in tears, and the groom spent the rest of the night apologizing to her family. Edit. Surprisingly, the couple is still together. They've cut ties with the best man, and honestly, I think they're better off without him. Sometimes weddings aren't just about uniting two people. They're about figuring out who doesn't belong in your life. Story 18. A destination wedding I filmed in the mountains started with so much promise. The couple was adventurous and wanted an intimate ceremony with just a few close friends and family. Everything seemed perfect until the bride's brother decided to bring his new girlfriend, uninvited. She showed up in a dress so sparkly it could have been a disco ball, immediately drawing attention away from the bride. During the ceremony, the girlfriend's phone rang loudly, and instead of silencing it, she answered it saying, "I'm at some wedding thing." The bride shot her a look that could have melted the snow around us. Later, during the toasts, the girlfriend got tipsy and started making loud jokes about how she should have worn white. The bride and groom managed to laugh it off, but I could tell it was a sore spot. A week later, the bride messaged me, asking if I could Photoshop the girlfriend out of some of the photos. Needless to say, that relationship didn't last long, but the bride and groom are still happily married. Story 19. The most heartbreaking wedding I ever worked on took place in a small community hall. The bride and groom were young, barely out of college, and their families didn't seem thrilled about the union. The groom's father made several passive-aggressive comments about how marriages at this age rarely last, and the bride's mother refused to speak to anyone from the groom's side. During the first dance, I noticed the groom whispering to the bride. At first, it seemed sweet, but then her face crumpled, and she walked off the dance floor. Later, I found out that he'd told her he was having second thoughts. She spent the rest of the reception putting on a brave face, but by the end of the night, it was clear they weren't in a good place. They ended up separating a few months later, and honestly, I wasn't surprised. Weddings have a way of magnifying doubts, and sometimes those doubts are impossible to ignore. Story 20. I once photographed a wedding where the couple insisted on including their pets in the ceremony. The bride had her two cats brought out in tiny tuxedos, and the groom had his Labrador walk down the aisle as the ring bearer. It was adorable, until the dog decided he didn't like the cats. Mid-ceremony, the Labrador barked and lunged at the cats, who leapt off the bride's lap, sending her bouquet flying. The bride tripped over her dress trying to catch them, and the officiant lost his place in the vows. The groom tried to calm the dog, but it only made things worse when the leash slipped out of his hand. The entire wedding paused as the cats hid under a table and the dog chased them around. Despite the chaos, the couple laughed it off and turned it into a funny memory. They even asked me to include the pet chaos photos in their wedding album, saying it was the perfect representation of their life together. Sometimes, the best weddings are the messy, unpredictable ones that make you laugh for years afterward. Story 21. One of the most nerve-wracking weddings I ever worked on was held in the middle of summer, during a brutal heat wave. The ceremony was outdoors, and the temperature hit 102 degrees by the time the bride walked down the aisle. You could see everyone sweating through their clothes, fanning themselves with programs, and shifting uncomfortably in their chairs. The bride looked stunning, but visibly miserable in her multi-layered gown. About halfway through the vows, she whispered to her groom, "I think I'm going to pass out." Without missing a beat, he swept her off her feet, literally, and carried her to a shaded area. He stayed with her while a bridesmaid fetched water, and when the officiant asked if they wanted to postpone the ceremony, the bride shook her head. "Let's finish this," she said, her voice shaky but determined. They exchanged vows sitting down under a tree, and everyone applauded when they finally kissed. At the reception, the bride ditched her dress for a simple sundress, and the couple danced barefoot under the stars. It wasn't the wedding they'd planned, but it was one of the most heartfelt I've ever seen. Drunk. Story 22. One couple I worked with was so caught up in the aesthetics of their wedding that they forgot the day was supposed to be about love. The bride spent hours micromanaging the decor, snapping at her bridesmaids and barking orders at the caterers. The groom, meanwhile, spent the entire morning on his phone, answering work emails. When it came time for the vows, they both read from cue cards they'd clearly written at the last minute. The bride's vows included a line about how she appreciated his career success, and the groom said something about how she was always well dressed. There was no mention of love, trust, or commitment. At the reception, they barely spent any time together. The bride was busy posing for photos with her friends, while the groom sat at a table with his business associates. By the end of the night, they looked more like strangers than newlyweds. Unsurprisingly, I heard they divorced within 2 years. Weddings can be beautiful, but if there's no heart behind them, they're just a performance. Story 23. I once filmed a wedding where the couple's families had a history of bad blood. They tried to keep things civil, but tensions boiled over during the reception. It started with the father of the bride refusing to toast the groom, muttering under his breath that his daughter could have done better. The groom's brother fired back, loudly saying, "At least we didn't bankrupt ourselves for this wedding." By the time the speeches ended, the two families were sitting at separate tables, glaring at each other. The breaking point came when the bride's uncle and the groom's cousin got into a shouting match over who had more right to stand near the dance floor. The DJ had to cut the music, and the bride ran out of the room in tears. Edit. A few months later, the couple sent me a heartfelt thank you note, apologizing for the chaos and saying they were now in couples therapy, not for their own issues but to figure out how to deal with their families. At least they're trying to make it work, and honestly, I'm rooting for them. Story 24. One wedding I shot had an absolutely picture-perfect venue, a cliffside overlooking the ocean at sunset. But the couple's relationship was far from perfect. The groom was constantly on edge, snapping at the wedding planner and refusing to pose for photos. The bride, meanwhile, kept apologizing for him, saying, "He's just stressed. It's been a long day." The real moment of truth came during the first dance. They'd chosen a romantic ballad, But halfway through, the groom walked off the dance floor saying, "I need some air." The bride stood there, looking humiliated, before quietly following him outside. I later heard from a guest that they'd had a huge fight about their future, right in the middle of the reception. They stayed together for a while, but a year later, I saw on social media that the bride had moved out and was living her best life. Sometimes weddings are the beginning of something beautiful, but other times they're the beginning of the end. Story 25. One of the most chaotic weddings I ever worked on involved a DIY backyard ceremony. The couple had insisted on doing everything themselves to save money, from cooking the food to setting up the decorations. But by the time the day arrived, nothing was ready. Guests showed up to find the bride's family still hanging string lights, and the groom's friends frantically grilling burgers. The ceremony started an hour late, and the bride was so stressed she tripped on her dress walking down the aisle. When they finally exchanged vows, the groom made a joke about how he was just here for the free food, which earned him a glare from the bride. During the reception, the rented sound system stopped working, and the cake melted in the summer heat. But somehow, the couple laughed through it all. By the end of the night, they were dancing barefoot in the grass, surrounded by happy, slightly tipsy guests. It wasn't a polished wedding, but it was real, and honestly, that made it perfect. Story 26. I once filmed a wedding where everything screamed luxury. Designer dresses, imported flowers, and a venue straight out of a magazine. But what caught my attention wasn't the grandeur. It was the groom's body language. From the moment he arrived, he looked like a man counting the minutes until he could leave. He barely interacted with anyone, standing off to the side during group photos and checking his phone during the cocktail hour. During the ceremony, he stumbled through his vows, mumbling something about how he promised to do his best. Meanwhile, the bride poured her heart out, looking at him like he was the only person in the world. At the reception, he avoided her entirely, spending most of the night drinking with his friends. The bride kept smiling for the guests, but you could see her glancing at him, hoping for attention that never came. A few months later, I heard they had split up. Apparently, he'd confessed he wasn't ready to get married, but went through with it because he didn't want to disappoint his parents. Weddings may look perfect on the surface, but the truth always finds a way to show itself. Din. Story 27. A destination wedding in Hawaii sounded like a dream job, until I arrived and realized the couple wasn't on the same page about anything. The bride was ecstatic, embracing every moment, while the groom was frustrated about the cost of everything. "Do you know how much this stupid venue is?" he said to me as I set up my gear. His friends laughed nervously, but I could tell he wasn't joking. The tension came to a head during the reception. The bride was giving a heartfelt toast, thanking everyone for traveling so far to celebrate with them. The groom interrupted her, clinking his glass loudly and saying, "Let's hear it for my bank account too." The bride froze, her smile faltering, but she quickly recovered, brushing it off as a joke. The rest of the night was awkward. The couple barely spoke to each other, and the groom spent most of the time at the bar. Last I heard, they were still married but living separate lives in the same house. Some weddings reveal cracks in the foundation, and not all couples can patch them up. Story 28. One of the most emotional weddings I ever captured had nothing to do with the couple themselves. It was all about their families. The bride's parents were divorced, and her father had refused to RSVP. Everyone assumed he wouldn't show up, but halfway through the reception, he walked in with a small gift in hand. The bride froze when she saw him. She hadn't spoken to him in years, and you could see the mix of emotions on her face: shock, happiness, and maybe a little anger. Instead of making a scene, she walked over and hugged him tightly. Later, during the father-daughter dance, she broke down in tears. The groom joined them on the dance floor, wrapping his arms around both of them. The whole room was crying by the end of it, myself included. It reminded me that weddings aren't just about the couple. They're about healing, forgiveness, and bringing people together. Story 29. A barn wedding. I photographed turned into a complete disaster. thanks to the groom's immature friends. The couple had chosen a quaint, rustic theme, with hay bales for seating and mason jar centerpieces. Everything was perfect until the groomsmen decided to turn the cocktail hour into a drinking competition. By the time the reception started, they were loud, obnoxious, and knocking over decorations. The final straw came during the cake cutting. One of the groomsmen pushed the groom into the bride, smearing cake all over her dress. She burst into tears, running off to the dressing room, while the groom stood there, laughing with his friends. It took almost an hour to calm her down and convince her to return to the party. By then, most of the guests had left, and the mood was ruined. Unsurprisingly, the couple divorced a year later. Weddings show you who people really are, and sometimes it's not a pretty sight. Story 30. I once worked on a wedding that was nothing short of chaotic, but somehow it ended up being one of the most memorable days of my career. The couple had planned an outdoor ceremony in a park, but on the morning of the wedding, a massive thunderstorm rolled in. Guests were soaked, chairs sank into the mud, and the decorations were completely ruined. The bride, instead of panicking, turned to her groom and said, "Well, I guess we're getting married in the rain." They handed out umbrellas to everyone and moved the ceremony under a giant oak tree. The bride's dress was muddy by the end, and the groom's suit was soaked, but they couldn't stop laughing. At the reception, they skipped the planned dinner and ordered pizza instead, turning the night into a casual, fun celebration. By the time the rain stopped, the guests were dancing barefoot in the wet grass. That couple taught me something important. Weddings don't have to be perfect to be unforgettable. Edit. A few weeks after the wedding, the bride sent me a thank you email with a photo of her muddy dress. She wrote, "I'll never clean this. It's a reminder that the best moments come from the unexpected." Honestly, I think she's right. Story 31. One of the most uncomfortable weddings I ever worked on involved a bride who was clearly marrying the groom for reasons other than love. During the engagement shoot, she kept making comments like, "Well, at least he's financially stable," and "He's not my type, but I guess he's reliable." I thought she was joking, but on the wedding day, her attitude didn't improve. The ceremony was a formal affair, and the groom looked genuinely happy as he said his vows. When it was the bride's turn, she gave a short, generic response, something like, "Sure, I'll try my best." Everyone laughed nervously, assuming it was part of her humor, but I could see the groom's face fall for a split second. At the reception, she spent more time chatting with her friends and checking her phone than with her new husband. The groom tried to dance with her, but she rolled her eyes and said, "Not right now." A few months later, I heard they'd split up. Apparently, she told him she'd only gone through with the wedding because she didn't want to disappoint her parents. Weddings can be beautiful, but they can also reveal when someone's heart isn't really in it. Story 32. I'll never forget a wedding where the groom's family openly disapproved of the bride. From the moment I arrived, his mother was making snide comments about how the bride wasn't traditional enough, and how she didn't think the marriage would last. The bride's parents tried to stay polite, but the tension was palpable. During the family photos, the groom's mother refused to stand next to the bride, insisting she needed to be next to her son. The bride's face turned red, but she kept her composure. Later, during the reception, the mother-in-law gave a speech that started with, "I wasn't sure about her at first, but I guess she'll grow on me." You could hear a pin drop in the room. Despite everything, the bride handled the situation with grace. She spent the evening making sure her guests were happy, even dancing with the groom's younger siblings to lighten the mood. I later heard that the couple moved out of state to put some distance between them and his family. Weddings can be the start of a beautiful union, but sometimes they also highlight the battles a couple will have to face together. Story 33. A Backyard Wedding. I shot ended up being one of the most chaotic yet heartfelt events I've ever attended. The couple had decided to do everything themselves to save money, but they didn't realize how much work goes into planning a wedding. When I arrived, the bride was still setting up the chairs, her dress covered in sweat, while the groom was struggling to get the sound system to work. The ceremony started an hour late, and the bride forgot her vows, bursting into nervous laughter. Instead of getting upset, the groom pulled out a crumpled piece of paper and handed it to her, saying, "I figured this might happen." Everyone laughed, and the moment actually became one of the highlights of the day. During the reception, the couple danced barefoot in the grass while their guests enjoyed a potluck-style dinner. At the end of the night, the groom gave a speech, thanking everyone for being part of their perfectly imperfect day. That wedding taught me that love and humor can turn even the most chaotic situations into beautiful memories. Story 34. One of the strangest weddings I've ever worked on involved a couple who couldn't agree on anything. The bride wanted a traditional, elegant ceremony, while the groom wanted a cowboy chic theme. She insisted on a string quartet. He hired a country band. She ordered a sleek, modern cake. He asked the baker to add sugar pistils as decorations. The tension came to a head during the rehearsal dinner. The bride's father gave a heartfelt toast about how proud he was, but when it was the groom's turn to speak, he joked, "I'm just here for the whiskey." The bride looked like she wanted to disappear. On the wedding day, they barely spoke to each other, and by the time the reception rolled around, the groom was off playing poker with his friends while the bride sat alone. Last I heard, they called off the marriage a few months later. Sometimes the wedding isn't the beginning of a happy life together. It's the last warning sign before everything falls apart. Edit. Interestingly, I later bumped into the bride at another wedding I was shooting. She was a guest, and when I asked how she was doing, she smiled and said, "Better. At least this time I'm dating someone who actually listens to me." Story 35. There was one wedding where the weather nearly ruined everything. But somehow, it turned into one of the most magical days I've ever captured. The couple had planned an outdoor ceremony in the middle of a vineyard, but a sudden storm rolled in, just as the guests were arriving. Everyone scrambled for cover, and it looked like the ceremony might have to be cancelled. Instead of panicking, the bride grabbed her groom's hand and said, "Let's get married in the rain." The guests huddled under umbrellas as the couple exchanged vows in the downpour, with the vineyard in the background and rain dripping off their hair and clothes. When they kissed, everyone cheered, completely forgetting about the weather. At the reception, the couple embraced the chaos, dancing barefoot in the mud and encouraging their guests to do the same. By the end of the night, everyone was laughing and covered in dirt, but it didn't matter. It was one of the most joyful weddings I've ever seen. Weddings don't need to be perfect to be unforgettable. They just need to be real. Story 36. One of the most stressful weddings I ever worked on involved a couple whose families hated each other. From the moment I arrived, it was obvious. The bride's parents stayed on one side of the venue, the groom's parents on the other, and neither group even tried to hide their disdain. The ceremony started late because the bride's father refused to walk her down the aisle until the groom's mother apologized for something she'd said at the rehearsal dinner. She didn't. During the toasts, the bride's mother gave a speech about how proud she was of her daughter for making the best of a bad situation. Then the groom's father responded with, "Well, at least she's marrying up." The room went silent, except for the sound of wine glasses being drained quickly. By the end of the night, the couple looked completely drained, barely speaking to anyone, including each other. A few months later, I heard they'd separated. Turns out it wasn't just the families. It was the couple themselves who couldn't handle the pressure. Weddings reveal so much about the future, and in this case, it wasn't a happy one. Story 37. A winter wedding at a beautiful ski lodge was one of the most challenging events I've ever photographed. The couple was sweet, but the logistics were a nightmare. Half the guests got stuck in a snowstorm and missed the ceremony entirely. The bride's bouquet froze solid during outdoor photos, and the groom ripped his pants while trying to climb into a snowbank for a candid shot. Despite everything, the couple handled it all with humor and grace. When the caterer ran out of hot chocolate, the bride laughed and said, "We'll drink champagne instead." Later, during the first dance, the power went out, and they ended up slow dancing by candlelight while the guests sang along to their song. It wasn't the wedding they'd planned, but it was incredibly intimate and heartfelt. By the end of the night, I realized that the best weddings aren't the ones that go smoothly. They're the ones where the couple can laugh through the chaos and still focus on what matters. Story 38. One wedding I worked on was a complete disaster from start to finish. The bride's best friend, who was also her maid of honor, was caught flirting with the groom during the rehearsal dinner. The bride was furious, but decided to go through with the wedding anyway, saying, "I'm not letting her ruin this for me." On the wedding day, the tension was unbearable. The maid of honor looked smug, the groom looked guilty, and the bride looked like she was barely holding it together. During the ceremony, the bride stumbled over her vows, her voice trembling. At the reception, she avoided both the groom and the maid of honor entirely, spending most of the evening sitting with her parents. The worst part? The groom and the maid of honor were spotted leaving together after the reception ended. A month later, I heard the bride filed for divorce. Sometimes the warning signs are there all along. You just have to be brave enough to see them. Story 39. One of the most emotional weddings I ever filmed wasn't even supposed to happen. The bride had been diagnosed with a serious illness months before, and at one point, the couple considered postponing the wedding indefinitely. But the bride insisted, saying she didn't want to wait any longer to marry the love of her life. The ceremony was small, just close family and friends, held in the couple's backyard. The bride wore a simple dress, and the groom couldn't stop crying when he saw her. During the vows, she said, "No matter how much time we have, I want to spend all of it with you." There wasn't a dry eye in the room. At the reception, the couple danced like no one was watching, laughing and holding each other close. It was one of the most beautiful and bittersweet weddings I've ever been a part of. Last I heard, the bride's treatment was going well, and they were planning their first anniversary celebration. Some weddings remind you of what love is truly about, standing by each other, no matter what. Story 40. A summer wedding at a vineyard turned into a complete comedy of errors. The bride's dress got caught on a bush during photos, tearing the hem, and the groom accidentally spilled red wine on his white shirt during the cocktail hour. Things went downhill fast when a guest knocked over the wedding cake while trying to take a selfie. Instead of freaking out, the couple burst into laughter. The bride grabbed a plate and scooped up some of the cake, saying, "Well, it still tastes good." They handed out pieces of the salvaged cake to their guests, who joined in on the fun. During the first dance, the groom whispered something to the bride, and she laughed so hard she almost fell over. Edit. A few weeks after the wedding, the bride emailed me, asking if I had any candid photos of the cake disaster. She wanted to frame one as a reminder of how much fun they had, even when things went wrong. That's the kind of love that lasts, one that can find joy in the imperfections. Story 41. I once photographed a wedding where the bride and groom had polar opposite personalities. The bride was meticulous, making sure every flower was perfectly arranged, every plate polished, and every candle lit at the right angle. The groom? Let's just say he didn't even bother to iron his shirt. During the ceremony, the bride delivered heartfelt vows, describing how she loved the groom's carefree nature and sense of humor. The groom, in response, said, "Yeah, she keeps me organized, so I don't lose my keys." Everyone chuckled awkwardly, but you could see the bride's forced smile. The reception was even worse. The groom disappeared for half an hour, and when he returned, he smelled like cigars and whiskey. The bride, visibly upset, tried to pull him back into the party, but he shrugged her off, saying, "Relax, it's just a wedding." A year later, I saw on social media that they had separated. Sometimes, no matter how much one person tries to hold things together, a relationship can fall apart when the other isn't invested. Tug. Story 42. A wedding in a rustic barn turned into one of the most chaotic days I've ever witnessed. The bride's mother was a self-proclaimed wedding expert and insisted on taking over every detail, from the seating chart to the menu. By the time the bride arrived, nothing was how she'd planned it. The mother had replaced the bride's carefully chosen wildflower arrangements with red roses because she thought they were classier. She also moved the cake to a better spot, which just so happened to block the photographer's perfect shot. During the ceremony, the bride's mother loudly whispered critiques about the officiant, the music, and even the groom's suit. At the reception, the bride finally lost her patience. She grabbed the microphone and said, "Mom, I love you, but this is my wedding. Please, let me enjoy it." The room went silent, and the mother stormed out. Afterward, the bride and groom shared a private dance outside the barn, away from the drama. I later heard the bride had to go low contact with her mom to set boundaries. Sometimes weddings don't just unite two people, they help them draw lines where they're needed. Story 43. One of the sweetest weddings I ever worked on didn't have any of the usual glitz and glamour. The couple had been together for over 15 years and finally decided to tie the knot in a simple backyard ceremony. Their teenage kid served as the best man and maid of honor, and the entire guest list was under 30 people. During the vows, the groom said, "I've loved you since the moment I met you, and I can't believe it took me this long to make it official." The bride laughed and replied, "Better late than never." The whole day felt relaxed and joyful, with everyone pitching in to help. The groom grilled burgers for dinner, and the bride made cupcakes instead of a traditional cake. By the end of the night, the guests were sitting around the fire pit, sharing stories about the couple. It was a reminder that a wedding doesn't have to be extravagant to be meaningful. It just needs love, laughter, and good people. Story 44. A destination wedding in the mountains seemed like a dream, but it quickly turned into a nightmare. The bride's family was excited, but the groom's family acted like they were being dragged against their will. During the rehearsal dinner, the groom's mother made a comment about how a beach wedding would have been more fun, and things only got worse from there. On the wedding day, the groom's parents arrived late, wearing casual clothes instead of the formal attire requested. During the vows, the groom's father yawned loudly, earning a glare from the bride's side of the aisle. At the reception, the groom's mother refused to take photos, saying she didn't feel camera ready. The bride eventually broke down in tears, saying to the groom, "I can't believe they're ruining this for us." Edit. A few weeks after the wedding, I heard the couple had decided to go no contact with the groom's family. They sent out a statement saying they needed space to focus on their marriage without unnecessary negativity. Weddings are supposed to bring people together, but sometimes they show you who to leave behind. Dinner. Story 45. The most unexpected wedding I ever photographed involved a groom who had a secret surprise for his bride. They'd been planning a traditional ceremony, but on the morning of the wedding, the groom told me to prepare for a small change. I had no idea what he meant until halfway through the ceremony. When it came time for the vows, the groom pulled out a guitar and started singing a song he'd written for the bride. Her face lit up, and by the end of the song, she was in tears. The guests gave him a standing ovation, and the bride whispered, "This is why I married you." Later, during the reception, the groom admitted he'd been working on the song in secret for months, practicing in his car and at his office to keep it a surprise. The bride told me it was the most romantic thing anyone had ever done for her. Sometimes it's the unexpected moments that make a wedding unforgettable, and this one was no exception. Story 46. One of the most heartbreaking weddings I ever photographed involved a bride who seemed to be living her dream while the groom looked like he was trapped in a nightmare. The venue was a stunning lakeside resort, and every detail had been meticulously planned. The bride was glowing, chatting excitedly with her bridesmaids, while the groom sat in the corner with his groomsmen, barely looking up from his phone. During the ceremony, the bride delivered heartfelt vows that left the audience misty-eyed. When it was the groom's turn, he stumbled over his words, eventually muttering, "Yeah, I'll try my best." The officiant looked confused, but continued anyway. At the reception, the groom spent most of his time drinking with his friends, leaving the bride to entertain guests alone. She tried to laugh it off, but you could see the disappointment in her eyes. A few months later, I heard through mutual friends that they'd separated. Apparently, the groom had never really wanted to get married, but felt pressured by their families. Weddings may be beautiful, but they can't fix a relationship built on shaky foundations. Story 47. I'll never forget a wedding where the groom's best man turned the reception into his personal comedy hour. The ceremony was simple and lovely, with the couple exchanging heartfelt vows under a canopy of flowers. But when it came time for the best man's speech, things took a sharp turn. He started by joking about the groom's wild days, which got a few laughs. Then he shifted to embarrassing stories, including one about how the groom had once kissed someone else on a dare while dating the bride. The laughter turned to awkward silence as the bride's smile froze in place. The groom tried to cut him off, but the best man kept going, saying, "Hey, it's all in good fun, right?" The bride left the room shortly after, and the groom followed, leaving the best man standing awkwardly at the mic. The rest of the night felt tense, and the couple didn't even stay for the cake cutting. Weddings are supposed to be about celebrating love, but sometimes people forget that and make it all about themselves. Story 48. A winter wedding in a historic mansion seemed like a dream come true for the couple, but it quickly became clear that they hadn't accounted for one key factor: the weather. A snowstorm hit the morning of the wedding, and half the guests couldn't make it. The outdoor photo session had to be cancelled because the bride's dress started freezing to the ground. Despite all the setbacks, the couple stayed positive. They moved the ceremony indoors to a cozy sitting room with the guests crammed together on antique chairs. The groom, who had planned a long, flowery vow, improvised and said, "I don't need fancy words, I just need you." The bride teared up, saying it was more perfect than anything he could have written. At the reception, they turned the snowy chaos into a celebration, inviting the guests to have a snowball fight outside and serve hot chocolate instead of champagne. It wasn't the wedding they'd planned, but it was one no one would ever forget. History 49. I once worked on a backyard wedding that went from heartwarming to awkward in record time. The couple had decided to keep things intimate, with just close family and friends. Everything was going smoothly until the bride's father decided to make an impromptu toast. He started off sweetly, talking about how proud he was of his daughter. But then he turned to the groom and said, "You better treat her right because I've got my eye on you." The guests laughed nervously, but he didn't stop there. He went on to talk about how the groom wasn't his first choice and how he hoped he would grow into a good husband someday. The bride looked mortified, and the groom was visibly upset. Afterward, the bride pulled her father aside, and I could see her gesturing angrily while he just shrugged. The mood of the party never quite recovered. Last I heard, the couple was doing fine, but the bride's relationship with her father is still strained. Weddings can bring families together, or remind you why some people are better loved from a distance. Edit. I recently heard from a mutual acquaintance that the bride's father tried to apologize, but it didn't go over well. Some wounds take more than a half-hearted apology to heal. Story 50. One of the most inspiring weddings I ever worked on involved a couple who had been through more than most. They'd survived a long-distance relationship, family disapproval, and even a house fire that destroyed nearly all their belongings. When their wedding day finally arrived, they were determined to celebrate everything they'd overcome together. The ceremony was simple, but deeply emotional. Instead of traditional vows, they read letters they'd written to each other during their time apart. The bride spoke about how the groom had been her anchor through every storm, and the groom said she was his reason for believing in miracles. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. At the reception, instead of a first dance, they invited all the guests to join them for a group dance to their favorite song. It was chaotic but beautiful, with laughter and tears blending together. As I packed up my camera, the bride came over to thank me, saying, "This is the happiest day of my life, but it's only the beginning." That wedding reminded me why I love what I do, capturing moments that are as real and raw as the people living them. Story 51. One wedding I worked at had one of the most awkward family dynamics I've ever seen. The bride was incredibly sweet, while the groom was a bit of a jokester. His family? Total chaos. From the moment I arrived, it was clear his mom was not happy about the bride. She spent most of the day making passive-aggressive comments like, "Well, she's certainly no Martha Stewart," while the bride set up last-minute decorations. The tipping point came during the ceremony. Just as the officiant asked if anyone objected, the groom's mom coughed loudly and muttered, "I could say something, but I won't." Everyone froze, and the bride looked like she might cry. The groom shot his mom a glare, and the officiant quickly moved on. At the reception, the groom made a heartfelt toast about how much he loved the bride and how she made him a better person. His mom rolled her eyes the entire time, and at one point, she even walked out. Edit. I later found out the groom cut contact with his mother after the wedding. The bride shared that it was a tough decision, but they both agreed it was necessary to protect their marriage. Sometimes, love isn't just about who you include, it's about who you leave behind. Story 52. A vineyard wedding I photographed had one of the most surprising twists I've ever seen. The bride and groom seemed like a perfect match. Funny, supportive, and clearly in love. But their families were a different story. The bride's side was warm and welcoming, while the groom's side acted like they'd been dragged there against their will. The tension came to a head during the father-daughter dance. The groom's father loudly commented, "We didn't even need all this pomp," just as the bride and her father started dancing. The bride's dad glared at him, but the bride calmly finished the dance. Later, during the cake cutting, the groom's father made another snide remark, and the bride had had enough. She grabbed the microphone and said, "To everyone who's here to support us, thank you. To those who aren't, you're welcome to leave." There was a moment of silence, then applause from the bride's family and friends. By the end of the night, the groom's father had left, but the party continued without a hitch. That bride? She was a force to be reckoned with, and honestly, I respected her for standing her ground. Punked. Story 53. One of the smallest weddings I ever worked at was also one of the most emotional. The couple had planned a big celebration, but the bride's mother had passed away unexpectedly a few months before. Instead of canceling, they decided to honor her memory with a quiet ceremony in her favorite garden. The bride walked down the aisle holding a bouquet made from her mother's favorite flowers, and her father gave a touching speech about how proud her mom would have been. During the vows, the bride broke down in tears, saying she felt her mother's presence with her. The groom held her hands and promised to always support her, no matter what life threw their way. After the ceremony, they released butterflies in her mother's honor. The moment was so quiet and beautiful, I almost forgot I was there to work. By the end of the day, it was clear that love had carried them through their grief, and their wedding wasn't just a celebration of their union, it was a tribute to the people who had shaped them. Story 54. A barn wedding I shot was the epitome of rustic charm. Wildflowers in mason jars, string lights draped across wooden beams, and a live bluegrass band. Everything seemed perfect, except for one glaring issue: the groom's best man. From the start, he was loud, obnoxious, and clearly drunk. During the ceremony, he tripped on the steps leading up to the altar and nearly knocked over the bridesmaids. Everyone laughed nervously, but it got worse at the reception. His toast started off harmless, with a few light-hearted jokes about the groom. But then he started talking about the groom's exes, saying, "Remember that one time you almost proposed to Lisa? Thank God you didn't, right?" The bride's face went pale, and the groom looked like he wanted to disappear. The best man kept going, oblivious to the tension, until the groom finally yanked the microphone out of his hands. The rest of the night felt strained, and the bride spent most of it sitting with her friends instead of her new husband. Last I heard, the couple was still together, but the best man, he didn't get invited to any more family events. Weddings bring out the best in some people, and the absolute worst in others. Story 55. One of the most unexpectedly beautiful weddings I ever worked at started as a disaster. The couple had planned an outdoor ceremony, but a freak windstorm hit the venue just as the guests arrived. Decorations flew everywhere, chairs toppled over, and the officiant's notes were carried off into the distance. The bride was on the verge of tears, but the groom grabbed her hand and said, "Let's just do it right here." They moved the ceremony into the reception tent, surrounded by their guests holding makeshift lanterns made from string lights. Instead of giving up, the couple leaned into the chaos, laughing as the groom jokingly asked the officiant, You remember what to say, right? The vows were short but heartfelt, and when they kissed, the entire tent erupted into cheers. At the reception, the couple danced barefoot on the grass, their hair still windswept, but their smiles brighter than ever. It wasn't the wedding they'd planned, but it was one no one would ever forget. Sometimes, the best moments come when you let go of perfection and just embrace the unexpected. Story 56. I once photographed a wedding where the couple seemed perfect for each other, but the groom's best friend had other ideas. The ceremony was lovely, with handwritten vows and a string quartet playing softly in the background. The trouble started at the reception. The best man gave a toast that started out normal but quickly spiraled into chaos. "We all know James wasn't the settling down type," he said, laughing. "Honestly, we're all shocked he made it to the altar. Remember when you said you'd never get married, bro?" The guests laughed awkwardly, but the bride's smile faltered. The groom tried to interrupt, but the best man plowed ahead, adding, "Oh, and let's not forget Vegas." At that point, the bride stood up, saying, "That's enough. Thank you." The tension in the room was unbearable, and the groom spent the rest of the night trying to smooth things over. Edit. I later heard that the best man wasn't invited to their first anniversary party. Turns out, he'd been trying to sabotage the wedding because he didn't approve of the bride. Some people just can't handle letting go when their friends move on. Tiens. Story 57. A snowy winter wedding at a ski lodge sounded like the perfect backdrop for romance, but the groom's family turned it into a spectacle. The bride's family had flown in from out of state, and they were warm, friendly, and excited to be there. The groom's family, however, complained about everything: the cold, the food, even the bride's choice of music. The real drama unfolded during the family photos. The groom's mother refused to stand next to the bride, claiming she wasn't ready for pictures. When the bride politely asked her to step in, she responded, "I don't need to be in this one. It's not like we're family yet." The bride's face went red, but she held her composure, saying, "Actually, we will be in about an hour." The tension carried into the reception, where the groom's mother loudly criticized the table settings and refused to dance. By the end of the night, the bride was in tears, and the groom was apologizing to everyone. Last I heard, the couple was doing fine, but they'd decided to keep the groom's family at arm's length. Weddings can reveal the best and worst in people, and sometimes the worst isn't even from the couple. Tack. Story 58. One of the most touching weddings I ever worked at was a backyard ceremony with a couple who had been together for over 20 years. They had never seen the need for marriage until the groom was diagnosed with a terminal illness. They decided they wanted to make it official while they still had time. The ceremony was small but deeply emotional. The groom struggled to stand during the vows, so the bride knelt beside him, holding his hands. He spoke about how he'd loved her from the moment they met and how their life together had been the greatest adventure he could have imagined. The bride, in tears, said, "I've already had a lifetime with you, and it still doesn't feel like enough." After the ceremony, they danced slowly under the string lights in their backyard. Friends and family surrounded them, holding candles and singing along to the music. It was one of the most beautiful and heartbreaking moments I've ever captured. Story 59. A vineyard wedding I shot was stunning, until the groom decided to go rogue. Everything had been planned to perfection: the floral arrangements, the menu, even the timing of the sunset. But the groom, who'd been joking around all morning, took things a step too far during the ceremony. When the officiant asked if he took the bride to be his wife, he paused dramatically and said, "Well, I guess I'll have to now." The crowd laughed nervously, but the bride didn't. She forced a smile, but you could see the hurt in her eyes. Later, during the reception, the groom kept making similar jokes about being trapped and how marriage wasn't his idea. The bride spent most of the night with her friends, while the groom stayed at the bar with his buddies. A few months later, I heard they'd separated. Sometimes, humor is a way to mask nerves, but sometimes it's a sign of deeper issues. Story 60. One wedding I photographed had the most dramatic twist I've ever seen. The ceremony was beautiful, held in a cathedral with soaring ceilings and hundreds of guests. But halfway through the reception, the bride disappeared. At first, people thought she was just freshening up, but as time went on, whispers started spreading. The groom finally found her outside, sitting in her car. She confessed she felt overwhelmed and unsure if she'd made the right decision. Instead of panicking, the groom sat with her, holding her hand and saying, "If you're not ready, we can stop this right now. I love you, no matter what." After about 20 minutes, the bride smiled, kissed him, and said, "Let's go back inside." They returned to the reception, and no one was the wiser. I later heard they went to couples therapy after the wedding to work through some lingering doubts, and now they're stronger than ever. Weddings aren't always picture perfect, but sometimes the imperfect moments show the depth of a relationship. Story 61. One wedding I shot turned into a complete power struggle between the bride and her future mother-in-law. The ceremony was set at a beautiful estate with everything meticulously planned by the bride. But the groom's mom decided she had her own vision for the day, and it clashed with everything the bride had chosen. The trouble started during the pre-wedding photos. The mother-in-law arrived in a white dress, sparking whispers among the bridesmaids. When the bride politely asked her to change, she flat out refused, saying, "I think I look better in this than anyone else here." The bride gritted her teeth and let it go, but you could feel the tension in the air. Things escalated at the reception. During the toasts, the mother-in-law grabbed the mic and said, "I wasn't sure about this marriage at first, but I guess we'll see how it goes." The bride's jaw dropped, and the groom looked mortified. Later, the bride confronted her outside, and I saw a full-blown argument unfold near the catering tent. Edit. A year later, I saw the bride post an anniversary photo on social media with the caption, "The best decision I ever made, marrying him and going no contact with her." Sometimes, setting boundaries is the best wedding gift you can give yourself. Story 62. I once worked at a wedding where the bride and groom had decided to write their own vows, but the groom clearly didn't take it seriously. The bride's vows were heartfelt and emotional, detailing how she'd fallen in love with him and promising to always support him. When it was the groom's turn, he pulled out a crumpled napkin and read what could only be described as a poorly thought-out comedy routine. "Thanks for agreeing to marry me," he started. "I mean, who else would put up with my gaming marathons and bad cooking?" The audience laughed nervously, but the bride's smile faltered. He kept going, making jokes about how she better not get mad when he forgets to take out the trash. By the time he finished, the bride looked like she was on the verge of tears. At the reception, the bride barely spoke to him, and when they danced, her body language was stiff. I later heard that they split up less than a year later. Sometimes a wedding reveals just how mismatched two people really are. Ciao. Story 63. A backyard wedding I shot was supposed to be an intimate, low-key affair, but it quickly turned into a logistical nightmare. The couple had decided to do everything themselves, cook the food, set up the decor, and even build a dance floor out of plywood. When I arrived, the groom was hammering nails into the floor while the bride was frosting cupcakes in her wedding dress. The ceremony started late because the DJ couldn't figure out how to set up his equipment in the makeshift venue. When it finally began, the couple's dog ran down the aisle, knocking over the flower girl. During the vows, a neighbor started mowing their lawn, drowning out the couple's words. Despite all the chaos, the couple stayed positive. At the reception, they laughed about the mishaps and even invited guests to help finish decorating the cake. It wasn't the polished wedding they'd imagined, but it was filled with so much love and laughter that no one seemed to care. Sometimes, the imperfections make the day even more memorable. Story 64. A destination wedding in a tropical paradise seemed like the perfect setting, but the drama started before the ceremony even began. The groom's brother, who was also the best man, forgot the rings at the hotel. The groom was furious, and the brother tried to play it off like it wasn't a big deal, saying, "Just use placeholders for now." The bride, visibly upset, had to be calmed down by her bridesmaids. When the rings finally arrived halfway through the reception, the best man grabbed the mic to apologize. Instead of taking responsibility, He joked, "Guess this is what happens when you put me in charge." The bride didn't laugh, and the groom spent the rest of the night avoiding his brother. A few months later, I heard through a mutual friend that the brothers had a falling out over the incident. Weddings are supposed to bring families together, but sometimes they do the opposite. So, Story 65. One of the most heartwarming weddings I ever worked at involved a couple who had been together for over 10 years. They'd been through everything: job losses, family deaths, even a major car accident. And their wedding was a celebration of their resilience. The ceremony was simple, held in a park with just a small group of family and friends. Instead of traditional vows, they shared stories about the moments that had defined their relationship. The bride spoke about how the groom stayed by her side during her mother's illness, and the groom talked about how the bride's encouragement had helped him go back to school. At the reception, the couple surprised their guests by showing a video montage of their life together, from awkward first dates to the present day. By the time it ended, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Later, as they danced to their favorite song under a canopy of stars, I realized that this wedding wasn't about the flowers, the cake, or even the photos. It was about the unshakable bond they'd built over the years. Sometimes, the simplest weddings are the most profound. Story 66. I once photographed a wedding where the groom's behavior was a giant red flag from start to finish. The couple seemed happy during the engagement shoot, but on the wedding day, the cracks began to show. The bride was running around making sure everything was perfect, while the groom spent most of the morning complaining about how much the whole thing was costing him. During the ceremony, the officiant asked if the couple had prepared personal vows. The bride delivered a heartfelt speech about how much she loved the groom and how she couldn't wait to build a life with him. When it was the groom's turn, he shrugged and said, "I'm not great with words, so let's just skip to the I do." The laughter from the audience was awkward at best, and the bride looked visibly hurt. At the reception, the groom spent more time drinking with his groomsmen than interacting with the bride. When it came time for the first dance, he tried to decline, saying, "I'm not much of a dancer." The bride ended up dancing alone with her father, while the groom stayed at the bar. Edit. A year later, I saw the bride had posted on social media about filing for divorce. She captioned the post with, "Sometimes you don't see the truth until it's too late, but better late than never." Ishan. Story 67. A mountaintop wedding I filmed was one of the most stunning settings I had ever seen, but the groom's family managed to turn it into a nightmare. The couple had chosen the location because it was where they'd gone on their first camping trip together, but the groom's mother complained about everything, from the drive to the altitude. During the ceremony, the mother-in-law refused to sit in the front row, saying she didn't want to be that close to the action. She sat off to the side, glaring as the couple exchanged vows. At the reception, she loudly criticized the food, saying, "I could have made this better at home." The final straw came when she interrupted the bride during her thank you speech, shouting, "When are we getting grandchildren?" The bride burst into tears and left the reception early. The groom confronted his mother, but she refused to apologize, claiming she was just being honest. Last I heard, the couple had decided to move across the country to put some distance between themselves and his family. Story 68. One of the most emotional weddings I ever photographed involved a couple who had survived a major car accident together. The bride had spent months in physical therapy, and the groom had stayed by her side every step of the way. Their wedding was as much a celebration of their love as it was of their resilience. The ceremony took place in a small church, with the bride walking down the aisle using a cane. When she reached the altar, the groom took her hand and said, "I'll carry you through anything life throws at us." There wasn't a dry eye in the room. During the vows, the bride thanked the groom for being her strength and promised to spend the rest of her life making him as happy as he'd made her. At the reception, the couple's first dance was slow and deliberate, with the groom supporting the bride as they moved across the floor. The guests cheered them on, creating a circle around them and clapping in rhythm. It was one of the most beautiful moments I've ever captured. Proof that love really can conquer all. Story 69. A Beach Wedding. I photographed seemed like it was going to be picture perfect. The bride and groom were both laid back and adventurous, and their friends and family matched the vibe. Everything was running smoothly, until the officiant forgot the marriage license. When it came time to sign the papers, the officiant realized they'd left the license in their car, parked miles away from the beach. The groom joked, "Guess we're not officially married yet," and everyone laughed, but the bride looked panicked. One of the groomsmen offered to drive back for the license, but the bride shook her head and said, "Let's just enjoy the day. We'll sort it out later." The couple exchanged vows on the sand, and the rest of the day was filled with laughter, dancing, and bonfires on the beach. Later, the bride told me that forgetting the license was actually a blessing. It reminded her that the wedding was about their love, not the paperwork. They went to the courthouse the next day to make it official. Pass. Story 70. A garden wedding I shot was interrupted by an uninvited guest. Literally. The ceremony had just started when a neighbor's dog broke loose and ran into the middle of the aisle, barking loudly. The guests laughed as the groom tried to shoo the dog away, but the bride wasn't amused. She shouted, "Can someone deal with this, please?" The dog eventually wandered off, but the mood was already tense. During the reception, the bride vented about how the neighbor ruined her perfect day, while the groom joked about how it made the wedding more memorable. The bride didn't seem to appreciate his humor, and they spent most of the evening sitting at separate tables. Last I heard, the couple was still together, but they've had their fair share of ups and downs. Sometimes it's not the big things, but the small unexpected moments that show you how a couple handles life's curveballs. Story 71. I once worked at a wedding where the groom clearly didn't understand the concept of boundaries, especially when it came to the bride's friends. From the moment the bridal party arrived, he was overly familiar, cracking inside jokes with the bridesmaids and even pulling one of them aside for what looked like a very intense private conversation. The bride noticed, but seemed to brush it off, although her smiles grew tighter as the day went on. The ceremony itself was beautiful, but the real drama started during the reception. During the toasts, the maid of honor gave a heartfelt speech about her friendship with the bride, but the groom interrupted, saying, "Let's not forget who the real MVP here is, me." Everyone laughed awkwardly, but the maid of honor looked furious. Later, I caught the groom and the maid of honor arguing in a corner. The bride eventually found them, and there was a heated discussion that ended with the maid of honor storming out. The bride tried to salvage the night, but the tension was palpable. Last I heard, the couple was still married, but had gone low contact with the maid of honor. Weddings may unite people, but they can also reveal fractures that were there all along. Story 72. A barn wedding I photographed was a mix of stunning rustic charm and pure chaos. The couple had planned everything down to the last detail, but they hadn't accounted for one thing: the unpredictable behavior of their farm animal, Guess. They had decided to include their goats and chickens as part of the wedding decor, which sounded charming in theory. In practice, not so much. During the ceremony, one of the goats wandered into the aisle, nibbling on the bride's bouquet. The guests laughed, but the bride looked mortified. Then, as they exchanged vows, a chicken flew onto the groom's shoulder, startling him so much he nearly dropped the ring. The officiant tried to keep things on track, but by then, the bride was visibly frustrated. At the reception, things didn't improve. The goats knocked over one of the dessert tables, and a chicken managed to get into the photo booth, ruining several shots. Despite everything, the groom kept laughing, saying, "This is exactly why I love her. We thrive in chaos." The bride didn't look as amused, but they danced the night away regardless. Sometimes weddings remind you that no matter how much you plan, life has other ideas. Dunk. Story 73. A destination wedding in the Caribbean started out as a dream, but quickly turned into a logistical nightmare. The couple had flown in 50 guests, booked an entire resort, and planned the weekend full of activities. However, the groom underestimated the travel times between venues, and everything started running late. The ceremony was supposed to start at sunset, but the buses arrived an hour behind schedule. By the time the bride walked down the aisle, the sun had already set, and guests were using their phone flashlights to see. The bride, wearing a stunning lace gown, tripped on the uneven path and nearly fell. At the reception, the caterers ran out of food because several unexpected guests from the resort joined in, assuming it was an open party. The groom laughed it off, but the bride was visibly upset, whispering to her maid of honor about how this isn't what I envisioned. Despite the hiccups, the couple managed to share a beautiful first dance under the stars. Edit. A year later, I saw the bride post on social media, joking, "The wedding was a disaster, but the marriage is perfect." Sometimes, the hardest days are the ones you laugh about later. Story 74. A summer wedding at a vineyard turned into a day I'll never forget, mostly because of the heat. It was one of the hottest days of the year, and the couple had planned an outdoor ceremony with no backup plan. By the time guests arrived, everyone was sweating through their clothes, and the makeup artist had already touched up the bride twice. The ceremony started late because the officiant fainted from the heat, just as he was about to begin. While someone fetched water, the bride tried to stay calm, but you could see her fanning herself nervously. Once the officiant recovered, the ceremony continued, but halfway through, the groom's grandmother fainted as well. At the reception, the bride made the best of it, changing into a lighter dress and joking about how they should have just eloped in Iceland. The groom set up fans around the dance floor, and guests cooled off with cold drinks and ice cream. It wasn't the smoothest wedding, but their sense of humor carried them through. Sometimes, the best weddings are the ones where you learn to laugh at life's curveballs. Story 75. One of the most unique weddings I ever photographed involved a couple who wanted their big day to reflect their love of adventure. The venue was a mountaintop accessible only by a steep hiking trail. Guests were given the option to hike or take a shuttle, but the couple insisted on hiking up themselves, with the bride in her wedding dress and hiking boots. The hike was grueling, and by the time everyone reached the top, the guests were exhausted. The bride, however, was beaming, saying, "This is exactly how I pictured it, just us and nature." The ceremony was breathtaking, with panoramic views of the mountains and valleys. At the reception, held in a small lodge at the summit, the couple shared their first dance to an acoustic guitar performance by a friend. Instead of a traditional cake, they served s'mores, roasting marshmallows over a fire pit as the sun set. It was unconventional, messy, and absolutely perfect. Sometimes, the most memorable weddings are the ones that break all the rules and reflect who the couple truly is. This one was a perfect example of love and adventure intertwined. Story 76. I once photographed a wedding where the bride and groom's personalities couldn't have been more different. The bride was organized to the point of obsession. Color-coded seating charts, a checklist for every hour of the day, and even a printed script for the toasts. The groom? He showed up late to the rehearsal in a t-shirt and sneakers, laughing about how he forgot what time it started. On the wedding day, the bride was already in her dress hours before the ceremony, pacing nervously and asking me if the flowers were symmetrical enough. Meanwhile, the groom arrived 15 minutes before the ceremony, hair still wet from his shower, and jokingly asked, "Are we really doing this?" During the vows, the bride delivered a heartfelt speech that left everyone teary-eyed. The groom smirked and said, "Yeah, I love you too, most of the time." The laughter was awkward, and you could see the bride's disappointment. At the reception, the groom spent more time drinking with his friends than with the bride, and she eventually left early. A few months later, I heard they'd separated. Weddings are supposed to be the happiest day of your life, but they can also shine a spotlight on issues that were there all along. Story 77. One of the most memorable weddings I ever worked on started as a disaster. The couple had planned an elaborate outdoor ceremony, complete with a flower arch, a string quartet, and a live dove release. But on the morning of the wedding, it started pouring rain, and the backup indoor venue wasn't ready. The bride was on the verge of tears when the groom grabbed her hands and said, "Let's just get married in the rain." She hesitated, then smiled and nodded. The guests gathered under umbrellas as the couple exchanged vows in the middle of the downpour. When it came time for the dove release, the handler said it wasn't safe for the birds, so the groom jokingly grabbed a napkin and threw it into the air, saying, "There, a substitute dove." The crowd erupted in laughter, and the bride kissed him mid-laugh. At the reception, the couple embraced the chaos, dancing barefoot on the wet floor and joking about how they'd never forget their soggy wedding. That day taught me that love can shine through even the stormiest of moments, literally. Tumor. Story 78. A Vineyard Wedding. I shot started out beautifully, but quickly turned into a whirlwind of drama. The bride and groom were glowing during the ceremony, exchanging vows in front of a stunning backdrop of rolling hills. But as soon as the reception began, the groom's ex-girlfriend showed up uninvited. She claimed she was there to support him, but her actions said otherwise. She kept trying to pull the groom aside for one last conversation, and even tried to join the couple during their first dance. The bride finally confronted her, saying, "This is my day, and you're not welcome here." The ex-girlfriend stormed out, but not before throwing a glass of wine at the bride's dress. The bride held it together remarkably well, laughing with her friends as they helped clean the stain. The groom spent the rest of the night apologizing, but the couple ended the night on a positive note, dancing and laughing as if nothing had happened. Some weddings test your patience, but this couple's resilience and sense of humor got them through it. Story 79. One of the most emotional weddings I ever captured involved a groom who had been in the military for years. He and the bride had spent most of their relationship apart, with long deployments keeping them thousands of miles away from each other. Their wedding was as much a reunion as it was a celebration of their love. The ceremony was simple, but deeply moving. As the bride walked down the aisle, the groom broke down in tears, whispering, "I can't believe I finally get to keep you." During the vows, the bride spoke about how she had waited patiently for this day, and how every letter, video call, and homecoming had been worth it. At the reception, the groom surprised the bride with a slideshow of their journey together, set to her favorite song. By the end, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Later, as they danced under the stars, the groom said, "No matter what happens next, I'll never let go of this moment." It was a reminder that love can endure even the greatest distances. Edit. A few years later, I saw a social media post from the couple celebrating their anniversary with a photo from the wedding. The caption read, "Still worth the wait." It's always heartwarming to see love stories that stand the test of time. Story 80. One wedding I shot was held at a lakeside resort, and the couple had gone all out with the decorations. Floating candles, lanterns hanging from trees, and a fireworks show were all part of the plan. Everything seemed perfect, until the groom's father had a bit too much to drink. He started off harmlessly enough, dancing with the bride during the first song. But as the night went on, his behavior became more erratic. At one point, he grabbed the microphone and started telling embarrassing stories about the groom, including one where he'd accidentally gotten locked out of the house in his underwear. The guests laughed nervously, but the groom clearly wasn't amused. The breaking point came when the father stumbled into the dessert table, knocking over the wedding cake. The bride looked like she was going to cry, but the groom hugged her and said, "Hey, at least it's memorable, right?" The couple managed to salvage the night with humor, cutting into a backup sheet cake they found in the kitchen. Sometimes weddings don't go according to plan, but it's how couples handle the chaos that shows you what kind of marriage they'll have. This couple? They're definitely in it for the long haul. Story 81. I once photographed a wedding where the bride's younger brother almost stole the spotlight, in the worst way. The couple had decided on an elegant rooftop ceremony overlooking the city, and everything was perfectly timed to catch the sunset. The bride looked stunning, and the groom couldn't take his eyes off her. But just as the ceremony began, the bride's teenage brother decided it was a great time to fly his new drone. Without warning, it buzzed into the middle of the ceremony, causing the bride to flinch mid-vow. The officiant paused, the guests whispered, and the bride's father ran over to stop the boy. The drone's buzzing didn't end there. During the first dance, it reappeared, this time flying dangerously close to the chandeliers. The bride finally snapped, yelling, "Enough! Put it away!" The boy sulked, but the damage had already been done. Despite the chaos, the couple laughed it off during the toasts, joking about how they'd always remember their drone wedding. Sometimes, it's the unpredictable moments that make the best stories, even if they're not what the couple planned. Ding! Story 82. A small countryside wedding I shot had one of the sweetest couples I've ever worked with, but also one of the most overbearing mothers of the groom. From the moment I arrived, she was micromanaging everything, from where the guests should park to how the flowers were arranged. At one point, she even tried to change the seating chart, claiming the bride's family didn't need such prime spots. The ceremony itself was beautiful, with the bride and groom exchanging heartfelt vows. But during the reception, the mother of the groom gave a toast that made everyone uncomfortable. "I wasn't sure about this marriage at first," she began. "But I suppose I'll get used to it." The bride looked mortified, and the groom muttered something under his breath, clearly annoyed. As the night went on, the mother continued to make passive-aggressive comments, even trying to cut in during the couple's first dance. The bride and groom handled it gracefully, but you could tell they were relieved when she finally left early. Weddings are supposed to unite families, but sometimes they just highlight the tension. Story 83. A destination wedding in the mountains was one of the most picturesque events I'd ever been a part of, but it came with its own challenges. The couple had chosen a remote lodge accessible only by a winding road, and a sudden storm the night before made it nearly impassable. Half the guests arrived late, including the officiant, who got stuck behind a fallen tree. The bride was understandably stressed, but the groom stayed calm, telling her, "The most important thing is that we're here together." They decided to start the ceremony without the officiant, having their best friend step in temporarily. When the officiant finally arrived, soaked but smiling, the couple laughed and redid their vows just to include him. At the reception, the bride gave a toast thanking everyone for braving the weather and joked, "If we can survive this, we can survive anything." The night ended with the guests huddled around a roaring fireplace, sharing stories and sipping hot cocoa. It wasn't the wedding they'd planned, but it was perfect in its own way. Story 84. I'll never forget a wedding where the groom decided to prank the bride during their vows. Everything up until that point had been classic and romantic. Elegant floral arrangements, a string quartet, and the couple exchanging tearful smiles. But when it was the groom's turn to speak, he pulled out a tiny notebook and began listing all the reasons not to marry him. At first, the crowd chuckled, thinking it was part of a joke. But as he went on, mentioning how he always left his socks on the floor and hated doing dishes, the bride's smile began to fade. By the time he said, "And I'll probably forget every anniversary," the bride's expression turned icy. The awkwardness lingered through the reception, where the bride avoided the groom and spent most of her time with her friends. I later heard they sought counseling after the wedding to work through some communication issues. Weddings can be funny, but some jokes don't land the way you hope. Story 85. A seaside wedding I shot was one of the most serene I had ever seen, with the sound of waves crashing in the background and seagulls circling overhead. The couple was deeply in love, and their family seemed genuinely supportive, except for one uncle. From the moment the ceremony started, he was loud and disruptive, making comments like, "When's the food coming?" and pretending to snore during the vows. At the reception, he took it up a notch. During the toasts, he stood up uninvited and began rambling about how marriage was a trap and how the couple should enjoy it while it lasts. The bride's father eventually escorted him out, but not before he knocked over a table on his way out. Despite the disruption, the couple stayed focused on each other. They danced, laughed, and even made jokes about the uncle during the bouquet toss. "We've got the wild card out of the way," the bride said with a wink. It was a reminder that even with a few bumps, love can still take center stage. Edit. A few months later, I heard the couple sent the uncle a no-drama agreement before inviting him to their baby shower. Some people need boundaries spelled out, even for the happiest occasions. Story 86. I once shot a wedding that started out as a fairy tale, but ended up feeling more like a soap opera. The couple had been high school sweethearts, and their families were thrilled to finally see them tie the knot. Everything seemed perfect. Until the reception, when the bride's ex-boyfriend showed up uninvited. At first, he tried to stay low-key, mingling with other guests, but it didn't take long for the drama to start. He approached the bride while she was talking with her friends and said, "You know, you're making a big mistake." She froze, her smile dropping, and the groom noticed immediately. He walked over and calmly told the ex to leave, but the guy refused, saying, "I have just as much right to be here as anyone else." Security had to escort him out, but not before he yelled, "You'll regret this!" The bride was visibly shaken, but the groom reassured her, saying, "He's out of our lives for good now." They managed to salvage the rest of the night, but you could tell the incident left a shadow over the celebration. Weddings have a way of bringing out the best, and sometimes the worst, in people. Story 87. A rustic wedding at a family farm turned out to be one of the most chaotic events I've ever worked. The couple wanted a laid-back vibe, with homemade decorations and a barbecue-style reception, but they didn't anticipate how unpredictable farm animals can be. During the ceremony, a goat escaped from its pen and wandered down the aisle, nibbling on the bridesmaids' bouquets. The guests found it hilarious, but the bride was clearly annoyed, whispering to her maid of honor, "This wasn't part of the plan." Later, during the reception, the same goat managed to knock over a table of drinks, sending wine bottles crashing to the ground. Despite the mishaps, the couple rolled with the punches. At one point, the groom even posed for photos with the goat, holding a sign that read, "Wedding Crasher." By the end of the night, the guests were laughing and toasting to a day no one would forget. Sometimes the imperfections are what make a wedding truly memorable. Story 88. One of the most emotional weddings I ever photographed took place in the backyard of the bride's childhood home. The bride's father had passed away a year earlier, and she had chosen the location as a way to honor his memory. Every detail was carefully planned, from the floral arrangements he'd loved to the playlist featuring his favorite songs. During the ceremony, the bride's brother stepped in to walk her down the aisle, but she paused halfway to place a small bouquet on an empty chair reserved for her father. The moment was so powerful that even the officiant teared up. During her vows, the bride said, "I know my dad is here with us today, and I know he would have loved you as much as I do." The reception was filled with heartfelt toasts, including one from the bride's mother, who shared stories about how the groom had supported their family through difficult times. By the end of the night, it was clear this wedding wasn't just about the couple. It was a celebration of love, resilience, and family. Story 89. A lakeside wedding I shot was absolutely gorgeous, with the sun setting over the water and the couple exchanging vows on a small dock. But as serene as it looked, the groom's family was anything but. His mother was a perfectionist who openly criticized everything, from the choice of flowers to the food. The tension boiled over during the toasts. The bride's father gave a lovely speech about how happy he was to welcome the groom into their family. When it was the groom's mother's turn, she began by saying, "Well, I guess I don't have much of a choice, but to accept this marriage." The room went silent, and the bride's face fell. The groom stood up, took the mic and said, "Mom, if you can't support us, you don't need to stay." The guests applauded as she stormed out. Afterward, the bride and groom danced their first dance, and you could see how deeply they cared for each other. Sometimes, weddings are about more than love. They're about standing up for the life you want to build together. Edit. I later heard from a friend that the groom and his mother reconciled, but only after she apologized to the bride. It's proof that even the most dramatic moments can lead to growth. Dang. Story 90. A beach wedding. I worked on turned into one of the funniest, most unpredictable days of my career. The ceremony was set right by the shoreline, with waves crashing softly in the background. But no one anticipated the wind. As the bride walked down the aisle, a sudden gust caught her veil, ripping it off her head and sending it flying into the ocean. The guests gasped, but the bride burst out laughing, saying, "Well, I guess the ocean wants it more than I do." The groom ran after it, only to slip and fall in the wet sand, soaking his tuxedo. Instead of panicking, the couple leaned into the chaos. The bride ditched her shoes, the groom rolled up his pants, and they exchanged vows with sand between their toes. During the reception, the DJ joked about the most adventurous wedding ever, and the couple toasted to their ability to handle anything together. Sometimes weddings don't go according to plan, but it's how couples handle the unexpected that shows their true strength. This couple? They're going to weather every storm life throws at them. Story 91. I once worked at a wedding where the couple's dog nearly stole the show. The bride and groom were huge animal lovers and decided to make their golden retriever, Max, the ring bearer. Max was dressed in a little tuxedo and had the rings tied to a ribbon on his collar. It was adorable, until it wasn't. As the ceremony began, Max walked down the aisle perfectly, earning awes from everyone. But just as he reached the altar, he spotted a squirrel nearby and bolted off into the trees. Chaos erupted as the groom and two groomsmen ran after him, shouting, "Max, come back!" The bride stood there trying to hold her composure, but you could tell she was seconds away from losing it. Eventually, they retrieved Max and the rings, though his tuxedo was covered in mud. The couple laughed it off and said their vows with Max sitting between them, panting happily. Later, during the reception, the bride joked in her toast, "Who needs a perfect wedding when you have a perfect dog?" It wasn't the ceremony they'd envisioned, but it was uniquely theirs. Story 92. A winter wedding at a historic mansion was one of the most elegant I've ever worked, at least on the surface. The bride had spent months planning every detail, from the floral arrangements to the hand-painted invitations. But what she couldn't plan for was the groom's complete lack of enthusiasm. Throughout the morning, the bride was all smiles, thanking vendors and checking in with her bridesmaids. The groom? He barely said a word, sitting in the corner scrolling through his phone. During the first look photos, she twirled in her dress, asking, "What do you think?" He shrugged and said, "It's nice." The real kicker came during the ceremony. When it was time for the vows, the bride gave a heartfelt speech about how she'd always dreamed of this day. The groom, on the other hand, pulled out his phone and read a few generic lines he'd clearly Googled. The bride laughed nervously, but you could see the hurt in her eyes. A few months later, I heard through a mutual friend that they'd separated. Sometimes the signs are there all along. You just have to be willing to see them. Chang. Story 93. A mountaintop wedding I shot had one of the most breathtaking views and one of the most dramatic meltdowns I've ever witnessed. The bride had planned the entire day herself, refusing any outside help, and by the time the wedding day arrived, she was completely overwhelmed. The ceremony was running late because the bride insisted on redoing her hair after a gust of wind messed it up. The guests waited awkwardly as the groom paced nervously. When the bride finally appeared, she looked stunning, but you could tell she was on edge. Halfway through the vows, she burst into tears, not the happy kind. She whispered to the groom, "I can't do this," and walked off into the nearby woods. The guests sat in stunned silence until the groom went after her. About 20 minutes later, they returned, holding hands, and the bride said, "Let's try this again." The ceremony resumed, and the couple finished their vows with laughter and tears. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And in the end, that's all that mattered. Edit. The bride later emailed me, thanking me for capturing the raw, unfiltered moments of her day. She wrote, "It wasn't the wedding I planned, but it was the one we needed." Story 94. A vineyard wedding. I worked on turned into a day no one would forget, mostly because of the best man's speech. The ceremony was beautiful, with rolling hills in the background and a soft breeze making the bride's veil float like a dream. Everything seemed perfect, until the reception. The best man started his toast with a few harmless jokes about the groom's messy habits and his terrible cooking skills. But then he said, "Honestly, I didn't think he'd ever settle down. Remember that one weekend in Vegas? Oh, wait, maybe I shouldn't talk about that." The laughter died instantly. The bride's smile froze, and the groom looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. Despite the tension, the bride kept her composure, later telling me, "I knew what I was marrying into, but wow, that was a lot." The rest of the night was awkward, but the couple managed to recover by focusing on their guests and dancing the night away. Sometimes, weddings reveal more about friendships than they do about the couple. Story 95. A backyard wedding I photographed was a blend of cozy charm and unexpected surprises. The couple had decided to keep things simple, with mismatched chairs, homemade centerpieces, and a buffet of family recipes. Everything was going smoothly, until the father of the bride decided to improvise his toast. He started by talking about how proud he was of his daughter, which brought tears to her eyes. But then he turned to the groom and said, "I wasn't sure about you at first. You're not exactly what I imagined for my little girl." The guests shifted uncomfortably, and the bride whispered, "Dad, stop." Undeterred, he continued, saying, "But I guess you'll do. Just don't mess this up." The bride was clearly mortified, but the groom handled it with grace, raising his glass and saying, "Here's to proving you wrong." The tension lifted, and the guests erupted in laughter. The rest of the night went off without a hitch, but that toast? It's one I'll never forget. Sometimes weddings show you how strong a couple is, and this one proved they could weather anything, even awkward family moments. Story 96. A luxurious ballroom wedding I photographed had all the makings of a perfect day. Stunning decor, a live band, and a couple who seemed head over heels in love. But as the day unfolded, it became clear that the groom's nerves were getting the best of him. During the ceremony, as the officiant asked if he took the bride as his wife, the groom hesitated for a moment too long. The guests laughed nervously, and the bride gave him a gentle nudge. "Oh, of course I do," he blurted. But the awkward pause lingered in the air. The reception didn't go much better. The groom made a joke during his toast about finally giving up his freedom, and the bride's smile visibly tightened. Later, during the first dance, he stepped on her dress, tearing the hem. The bride tried to play it off, but by the end of the night, she looked exhausted from trying to smooth over his missteps. Last I heard, the couple was still together, but working on their communication. Weddings can highlight the cracks in a relationship, but they can also be a wake-up call for couples to grow together. Story 97. One of the most beautiful weddings I ever worked on was a lakeside ceremony that almost didn't happen. The couple had planned everything meticulously, but the bride's mother fell ill just days before the wedding. They considered postponing, but the bride's mother insisted they go ahead, saying, "I wouldn't miss this for the world, even if I have to watch from my hospital bed." The family set up a live stream so the bride's mother could see everything in real time. During the ceremony, the bride paused to speak directly to the camera, saying, "Mom, I love you. I wouldn't be who I am today without you." There wasn't a dry eye among the guests. At the reception, they played a video message from the bride's mother, who thanked everyone for celebrating her daughter and welcomed the groom into their family. The bride later told me it wasn't the day she'd imagined, but it was more meaningful than she ever could have planned. Sometimes, weddings are a reminder that love transcends even the toughest challenges. Story 98. A vineyard wedding I shot seemed perfect on paper. Breathtaking views, elegant details, and a couple who looked like they belonged in a magazine. But as the day went on, the tension between the bride and groom became impossible to ignore. During the portrait session, the bride kept critiquing the groom's posture, saying things like, "Can you at least try to look happy?" The groom muttered under his breath, "I didn't want all these photos anyway." At one point, he walked off, saying he needed a break, leaving the bride standing alone in her gown, looking visibly upset. The ceremony went smoothly, but the reception was filled with more passive-aggressive comments. When it came time for the first dance, the bride whispered, "You're actually going to dance with me, right?" The groom rolled his eyes but complied. Edit. A few months later, I heard the couple had entered counseling. The wedding may have exposed some cracks, but they were determined to work through them. Not all weddings are perfect, but sometimes they're the start of real conversations that lead to growth. Story 99. A backyard wedding I shot was one of the most fun and chaotic events I've ever been a part of. The couple had a come-as-you-are theme, encouraging guests to dress casually and bring their kids and pets. It created a relaxed, joyful atmosphere, until one of the kids decided to turn the sprinkler system on during the reception. The sprinklers erupted mid-dinner, soaking guests and sending everyone scrambling. Instead of panicking, the couple laughed hysterically and joined the kids dancing in the water. The bride's dress was drenched, and the groom's shoes were ruined, but they didn't care. "This is why we didn't go for a fancy ballroom," the bride joked, wringing out her hair. By the end of the night, the wet clothes and ruined decor didn't matter. The couple toasted to embracing the unexpected, and the guests cheered. Sometimes weddings remind you that it's the love and laughter that matter most, not the perfection. Story 100. A formal wedding at a historic estate turned into one of the most dramatic events I've ever photographed, thanks to the groom's outspoken grandmother. From the moment she arrived, she made it clear she wasn't thrilled about the match. During the ceremony, she whispered loudly, "She's too young for him," earning glares from nearby guests. At the reception, she refused to sit at her assigned table, saying she deserved a better spot. When the bride and groom cut the cake, she muttered, "I give them 2 years, tops." The bride's mother eventually confronted her, leading to a shouting match that had to be broken up by the groom. Despite the drama, the couple stayed focused on each other, dancing and laughing with their friends. "She's just set in her ways," the groom said, brushing it off. But the bride's patience wore thin by the end of the night, and she made it clear she wouldn't tolerate any more negativity. Edit. I later heard the couple decided to exclude the grandmother from future family events until she could respect their marriage. Weddings can reveal a lot about family dynamics, and sometimes boundaries are the healthiest gift you can give your relationship.